was so good, wonderful. As they were singing this down by the riverside, I was thinking about this joke that sometimes gets passed around on the internet. You get emailed the joke and you forward it, and there was this firebrand preacher in former times, and his topic for the day was abstaining from alcohol, and he's saying, I wish they would just take all the rum in the world and dump it in the river. And then I wish they would take all the whiskey in the world and dump it in the river, and all the beer and the wine. And then when he was finished, he said, our next hymn is, Shall We Gather at the River? Just this week, I was reading a newspaper article, very interesting, about the situation of Christians in Iraq and Syria. And those who were interviewed said that at one time we Christians and Muslims could live side by side. But now with the rise of ISIS, this group of, really vicious criminals, Christians are being persecuted very fiercely in those lands for their faith, and they experience tremendous hardship if they are not willing to renounce their Christian faith. Not so long ago, I was talking to a mother, and she was telling me that her teenage daughter faces some peer pressure around their family's church involvement. Now, I don't want to overstate this in any way, but sometimes it can be difficult to be a follower of Jesus. Sometimes someone might be persecuted for their faith. Sometimes those of us who have faith find ourselves experiencing tremendous difficulty, and we ask ourselves questions. How is it that God could allow this to happen to me as one of His people? Why am I being allowed to go through this? Friends, God knows this. God knows what each of us is going through. God cares about us individually and personally. And God knows what each one of us needs. My purpose today is to encourage you, wherever you are on your path of following Jesus, beginning, middle, or end, whether you are on an easy patch or a tough patch, God knows what you're going through, and God knows what you need. Our scripture portion today came from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 9. This is well into the story of Jesus. He has attracted a large following. He has taught great crowds. He has performed signs and wonders. He has healed the sick. He has fed the hungry. He has got into arguments with the religious leaders. And just before what we heard, Jesus said to His closest friends, the disciples, that He had to suffer and die at the hands of the religious leaders in order that He might rise again. Well, the disciples didn't hear the part about rising again. As soon as Jesus said that He had to suffer and die, they stopped hearing anything else. This was devastating news for the disciples. They had set their lives aside. They had left homes and families to follow Jesus, and they had done this because they had a confident hope that he was the Messiah, God's chosen one, the one to redeem their people. And they might have had different expectations, not even clear expectations of what it might mean for him to be the Messiah. Certainly it involved some kind of political liberation. What it did not mean was that he would suffer and die. And so when they heard Jesus say this, it was a terrible blow. And Peter, who was perhaps the leader of the disciples, pulled Jesus aside and said, Jesus, you got to stop talking like this. I know it's getting tough. I know you're facing opposition. But you've got to keep your spirits up. These other guys, they're depending on you. You've got to stay strong. Suck it up. And Jesus responded to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." And then Jesus took Peter and James and John, perhaps the three leaders or core within the disciples, and knowing what encouragement they needed, he took them aside. And Mark, the gospel writer, tells us that Jesus led those three up a high mountain where they were all alone. And they saw something amazing, something unbelievable. And then as Jesus led them down the mountain again, he told them not to say anything about what they had seen or heard. Most of what Jesus did was very public. He taught in public. He traveled in the open. He healed the sick in public. He fed the hungry in public. He did and said what he did so that others would see and recognize the coming of God's kingdom in their midst in his very actions. Not today's episode. That was for Peter and James and John. I don't know about you, but sometimes when I read those miraculous gospel stories, I only wish there had been a video camera there and we could see with our own eyes something of what happened. Well, in today's episode, that would be completely beside the point. What happened was for Peter, James, and John. And we learned something important about this. And that is that when we are going through challenges in our faith journey, God knows how it is for each of us in a deeply personal way. And God knows what we need, and God reaches out to us in personal ways. Now, of course, there are some things which God reveals to everyone. We might take a modern example of the need to care for our environment. The Bible tells us, for example, that God created the world and that the world is good, and that we as human beings are given the charge of looking after the world that God has made. Every one of us knows that. And in fact, one doesn't even have to be a believer in God. All kinds of people with no religious faith whatsoever recognize from a usefulness perspective that we all ought to take care of the natural world. so that future generations can enjoy what we have enjoyed. Some things God reveals to everyone all at once. But when we are facing deeply personal challenges, kinds of challenges which are so particular to our life's journey that no one else can possibly know what's going on with us, God reaches out to us personally and privately with a word of encouragement. Not very long ago, there was something which was really weighing on my heart and mind. I hadn't said anything to anyone. I hadn't prayed about it even. And someone dropped by to talk to me and offered me just the word of encouragement that I needed to hear. And in that person's encouragement, unbeknownst to them, I heard God reaching out to me with a word of love and support. I think in our faith journey, we want to know not just that there is a God out there somewhere, that there is a God who created the universe, but that there is a God who knows us personally, and a God who cares for us personally. Mark tells us that after Jesus led Peter, James, and John to the top of this high mountain, he was changed before their very eyes. His clothes became very white. The gospel writer, in fact, piles on the adjectives. It would be something like greatly, exceedingly, incredibly, very white. It was an allusion, in part, to an episode in the Old Testament book of the prophet Daniel, where the prophet has a vision of God the Creator, and God is whiter than white can be, a white that shines with brilliance, kind of white one can hardly look directly at it. And in this episode, Mark, the gospel writer, reports that Jesus' garments became whiter than anyone on earth could possibly whiten them. And what we are to learn from this is that when God reaches out to us to speak personally to our need, we might be left with no conclusion, but that this message has come from God. It could not be explained in any other way than that it came from God. I used to have a friend who is now a Presbyterian minister, and I haven't been in touch with her for a few years. She's moved off to a different area. And one time she was telling me about how she experienced a call to the ministry. She was in church one time, and in a way that she couldn't understand or explain, she happened to glance over at a stained glass window. And she experienced that Jesus came literally out of that stained glass window, holding the symbols of the bread and the cup that were there in the window. And Jesus emerged from the window in this vision and looked at her and spoke to her and said, "Share these with my people so that they will remember me." I have never had an experience like that. When I hear stories like that, I don't know quite what to make of it. she is convinced that that message came from God. There is no other explanation in her mind for what she experienced than that it came from God. So much so that she was willing to bet her whole life on it. Mark tells us that after this, Moses and Elijah appeared, and they were conversing with Jesus. This is another rich image. You see, Moses was the mediator of the law. God gave a Torah to Israel through Moses at Mount Sinai. Elijah was the greatest ever prophet of Israel. He was God's prophet par excellence. And we are meant to see here that Jesus is in continuity with and fulfillment of the law and the prophets, the sources of authority for God's people. And then Mark tells us that Peter said something like this: "It's a good thing we disciples are here, Jesus. How about we build 3 tents or something like that, and one can be for you, and one for Moses, and one for Elijah." And then it kind of gets dropped. There's no further discussion and no response from Jesus to that idea. And Mark concludes that Peter had said that because he didn't really know what to say. I think that's how we know Peter was an extrovert. He didn't know what to say, but he said it anyway. Some of you, like me, are introverts. We have something to say and we don't say it, and then we wonder why others haven't read our minds. What we learn is this: that sometimes when God has reached out to us, it is confusing. Communication from God does not always orient. Sometimes it disorients. Many years ago, when I first experienced what for me was a calling from God to go into the ministry, to do this work which I now do, I had no idea what to make of it. I found it very confusing. I didn't know how to tell anyone. I didn't even really know what to do about it. And I got really quiet for quite a long time. And finally, when I had thought of something I might do or something I might say, I mentioned this to my parents. I said, I'm feeling a calling of this kind. And my mom surprised me. She said, well, I was wondering about that because you just haven't been yourself lately. You've been very quiet. I'd received some kind of message from God, a hopeful one, but didn't quite know what to say or do. And sometimes when God reaches out to us, at least in the short term, it can be very confusing. And there's nothing wrong with that. It takes us time to reorient ourselves to a new kind of reality. Next, Mark tells us that a cloud descended upon them at the top of the mountain. Another rich image from the tradition of Israel, for a cloud often symbolized the presence of God. You may remember the story of the Exodus and how the Hebrews were led out of their slavery in Egypt, and they followed the presence of God, which was a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. And the cloud descended upon them on this mountaintop, and a voice spoke to Peter and James and John and said, "This is my beloved Son. Listen to him." And this reminds us that when God knows our need, when God reaches out to us, we are pointed to Jesus, to look to him and to listen to him. Because even in times when we are most confused, it is in Jesus that we see and hear God most clearly. One of my favorite films is called The Mission. It tells the story in particular of two main characters. One is a Catholic priest. His name is Father Gabriel. In the 1600s, he is a missionary to the Guarani indigenous people of South America. The other main character is Rodrigo Mendoza. He is a slave trader. He tries to capture and kidnap the Guarani so that he can sell them into slavery. Father Gabriel is a very wonderful missionary. He is very successful. He is not trying to transmit his culture or his politics, but simply his love of Christ to the Guarani. Mendoza is a callous, evil man. Mendoza gets thrown in prison because he killed his brother in a jealous rage. As part of his punishment or sentence, Mendoza was sent to help Father Gabriel and the other missionaries. In the course of carrying out this sentence, Mendoza is mesmerized by the faithfulness and the love of Father Gabriel and his colleagues, and in fact, he repents of his sin and decides to become a priest. For a time, the two work in harmony. Then, in a political dispute, which has more to do with European politics than anything going on in South America, both the Spanish and the Portuguese colonialists decide that it's time to drive the Guarani off their land and force them to go further into the jungle. To this, there were two different responses. Mendoza, a trained mercenary, decides to take up arms. He trains the Guarani in combat and how to use some modern weapons. And alongside some of the warriors, he puts up armed resistance. He is killed. Father Gabriel, on the other hand, refuses to fight. He will not kill another. And while the fighting approaches, Father Gabriel and many of the Guarani are in the sanctuary they had built, praying. As the soldiers get closer and closer, Father Gabriel leads a procession out of the church. And he is holding high over his head a cross-shaped object which is designed to hold a consecrated host, which in the Roman Catholic way of thinking is literally the flesh of Jesus. And as the gunfire is raining down on them and their village, they walk in procession behind this symbol of Christ. They would rather die for their faith than take up arms. Father Gabriel is hit, and he goes down, and the cross holding the consecrated host falls to the ground. And one of the little Guarani boys picks it up and holds it over his head and continues the procession. At the end of the film, there is a caption. The light has shone in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. It is a quote from the opening words of the Gospel of John. The director of the film is Roland Joffe, an Englishman. He is not a person of faith. He is an agnostic. In interviews about the movie, he says he wanted to tell the story because it was a remarkable story of transformation. And he goes on to explain that he thinks the movie is about Mendoza, this awful character who goes from wanting to enslave the Guarani to someone who takes up arms in their defense. And that is a remarkable transformation. And I've watched the movie many times, and I try to watch it with great skepticism. But every time it's over, I think, that's a movie about Jesus Christ and the remarkable power of genuine faith in Him. God, our Maker, in surprising and even unbelievable ways, seeks to point us to Jesus. Because in the midst of life's difficulties and confusions, it is in Him that we see and hear God most clearly. One of Jesus' most challenging sayings is this. It's recorded in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 7. He said, "The gate is wide, and the road is easy that leads to destruction. Because that way is easy, many take it. The gate is narrow, and the road is difficult that leads to life. And because it is a hard way, very few take it. God knows it is difficult to be a follower of Jesus. God knows that when you go through times of difficulty, when it feels as if circumstances against all odds have conspired to make your life painful, you may question what it all means and whether there is any point in having faith. God knows this. God knows at times you may even experience suffering inflicted upon you because of your faith. If you're a Christian who lives in 2015 in Iraq or Syria, that may be very severe suffering. If you live in Barrie, Ontario, it may just be that your friends and family and neighbors start to squirm a little bit when the subject of your church attendance comes up. God knows what you're going through. God knows what you need. God reaches out in love and wants to offer it to you. May we have the strength and courage to put our trust in him.